Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1878. The wind carried frost off the mountains, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the pines when she stumbled into his barn and collapsed. Kiera Whitlow had not meant to come this far. Her boots were soaked through, her dress torn at the hem, and the ache in her legs burned hotter than her lungs. She had been walking since sunrise after the last town turned her away again. She had not eaten since the bread crusts yesterday. When she saw the barn tucked behind the cottonwoods, she thought maybe she could just rest, just for a moment. She pushed open the heavy door, stumbled past a mule chewing lazily in the corner, and then everything went black. Merritt Paxton had not heard the barn door open, but he did hear the mule grunt the way it only did when someone unfamiliar got too close. He was halfway through splitting logs when he turned toward the sound. His rifle was by the door, but he left it there was no panic in the mule's voice, just confusion. He stepped inside, boots crunching hay, and stopped short. There was a woman on the floor. She was on her side, face pale and arms limp beneath her. Her hair had fallen loose from its braid, dusty blonde strands sticking to her cheek. She was breathing, but barely. Merritt dropped to his knees beside her. "Miss," he touched her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" "Nothing." He ran to the house, filled a tin cup with water from the pump, and rushed back. He lifted her head gently, holding the cup to her chapped lips. She did not drink. "Come on," he muttered, voice low and coaxing. "You made it to the barn. Do not stop now." He sat beside her, back against the wall, set the cup nearby, and laid his coat over her. He did not know who she was or why she was alone, but no one collapsed like that without a story. Merritt had seen enough of hunger and desperation to recognize both. He stayed all night. The barn went cold, and he stoked a small fire in the old stove in the corner. The flames danced on the beams above, casting light across her face. He checked her breathing, gave her sips of water when her lips twitched, and when she stirred, he leaned close. "Easy," he said. "You are safe." She blinked slowly, eyes unfocused, then looked at him. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "Where?" "My barn," Merritt said. "You fainted, I brought you water. Just rest." She stared at him for a long second, then her eyes closed again. She woke properly the next morning, sitting up slowly, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Merritt was by the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "You are awake," he said. Kiera nodded, eyes wary. "I did not mean to trespass. I just needed to sit." "You did more than sit," Merritt said, walking over and handing her the coffee. "You passed out cold. You all right?" She took the cup with both hands. "I will be." He crouched across from her. "Where were you headed?" "West," she said. "Anywhere with work? You alone?" She hesitated. "Yes," Merritt nodded slowly. He did not ask more. She looked like she was used to being asked too many questions already. "I am Merritt Paxton," he said. "This is my place." "Kiera," she said softly. "Kiera Whitlow, do you want something to eat?" She looked down, embarrassed. "I do." He helped her to the house, slow steps across the frosted earth. Inside, the stove was already hot, and he set a pan of eggs and potatoes on while she sat at the table. She looked too thin. Her dress was worn, her shoes cracked where the soles had started to peel. After she ate, he handed her a second cup of coffee. "Where are you from, Kiera?" She stared at the cup. "Texas Hill Country, but that was a long time ago. You got family?" She hesitated again. "Not anymore." He did not press. Something in her voice made it clear she had lost more than she was ready to speak on. "I could use help around here," Merritt said after a long pause. "If you want to stay a while." Kiera looked up, startled. "Why would you let me?" He shrugged. "Because you need it, and I got more chores than two hands can manage." She studied his face, square jaw, warm brown eyes, sun-darkened skin. He was not a man trying to impress, just one offering something simple and kind. She nodded. "I can work. I figured you could." That first week passed quiet. Merritt showed her the chickens, the vegetable patch, how to split kindling and carry water from the creek. Kiera did not talk much, but she worked hard. She flinched at sudden sounds, and sometimes her eyes went distant, like she was someplace else entirely. He never asked about it. One morning, Kiera was brushing the mule when she spoke. "My husband died 4 years ago." Merritt looked up from where he was mending a fence post. He waited. "We had a little boy, Finn. He died 2 winters after that." Merritt stood, slow and steady. I am sorry, she nodded, jaw tight. After that, I just kept moving, trying not to think. You do not have to keep moving now. They stood in silence, the air thick with unsaid things. Then she walked over, handed him the brush. Your mule is a brat, she said. He smiled for the first time in front of her. That he is. By the second week, she started humming when she cooked. By the third, she laughed at one of his bad jokes. She still had shadows behind her eyes, but they were not quite so dark now. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun melt behind the hills. Merritt handed her a cup of warm cider. You never told me what you did before. I used to teach. She looked down, but after Finn. I could not be in a schoolhouse, not with other people's children. Merritt nodded. You do not have to explain. Kiera glanced at him. You are kind, Merritt. He met her eyes. You make it easy to be. She looked away quickly, but her cheeks flushed. The wind picked up. He stood and took her empty cup. You need more blankets for your room. I am warm enough, she said. Thank you. He nodded once, then stepped inside. She watched the door after it closed, something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. It had been a long time since anyone stayed just to make sure she woke up. The old root cellar needed shoring. Merritt had known it for a while. Each rain sent more damp through the cracks, and one wall had started to lean. That morning he brought out the shovel and crowbar, stepping careful around the frost-stiff ground. Kiera followed with a coil of rope over her shoulder, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. He pointed to the sagging joists. If we don't brace those, the whole thing'll come down by spring. I can hold the beams steady while you dig, she said, but you'll need to anchor it deeper. Merritt gave a short nod, surprised but not displeased. She'd leaned into the work like she belonged to it now, and it showed in the way she moved, measured, capable, steady. They worked in silence for a while, the scrape of tools and shifting dirt the only sounds. When he paused to wipe his brow, he glanced at her through the pale sunlight slanting across the slope. You always this handy? He asked. Kiera leaned her weight into the beam, bracing it firm. My pa was a cooper. I grew up turning wood and patching things. He used to say a girl who can fix a barrel can fix just about anything. Sounds like he was right. She didn't reply, just adjusted her stance and watched as Merritt drove the support post deeper. When the work was finished and the cellar stood solid again, Merritt rested his arms on the shovel handle, breathing through the cold air. Kiera, she looked up. I was thinking, you might want to see the north pasture, wild plum trees out that way. They'll bloom come spring, but even bare, it's worth the walk. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. All right. They walked slow, the trail rising toward a ridge where the wind ran sharp between the junipers. Neither spoke for the first while, their feet crunching over old needles and ice-dusted grass. At the ridge, Merritt stopped and gestured. There. Below lay a stretch of open land bordered by cottonwoods and the beginnings of a creek that would swell with meltwater come thaw. The plum trees stood scattered, their limbs dark and bare but their shape graceful against the sky. Kiera stepped beside him, quiet. My boy would have loved this, she said without looking at him. He didn't answer, just stood with her, watching the wind move across the hill. After a while, she turned. You always live here alone. My brother used to stay through the winters. He left for Cheyenne 2 years back. Why'd he go? He wanted to feel important, Merritt said. Didn't think dirt and cows were enough. Kiera's eyes softened. And you? I don't mind quiet, he said, or staying put. The wind picked up again. Kiera pulled her shawl tighter. Merritt reached into his coat pocket and handed her a pair of gloves. They are old, he said, but warm. She hesitated, then took them. Thank you. They walked back as the light thinned, shadows stretching long behind them. That night after supper, Merritt set a kettle on the stove and pulled 2 chipped cups down from the shelf. Kiera sat at the table, rubbing warmth into her hands. I could mend that tear in your coat, she said. If you've got thread, he turned, surprised. You sew too? I used to make all of Finn's clothes, she said, voice low. I haven't stitched in a while. I've got a kit in the drawer, he said, nodding toward the sideboard. If you're sure. She rose, crossed the room, and pulled out the bundle of needles and waxed thread. As she sat back down and set to work, Merritt watched her fingers move deft and sure, though her hands bore the roughness of travel and cold. I never asked, he said slowly. When did you last have a place you stayed longer than a week? Before last winter, she said, but that didn't end well. What happened? The woman who took me in said I reminded her too much of her sister. It made her bitter. Merritt nodded slowly. You don't remind me of anyone. Kiera looked up, Needle paused. I mean, he said, clearing his throat, you're not like anyone I've known. She looked down again, the faintest smile touching her lips. Neither are you. A quiet filled the room, not heavy, not strained. When she finished, she held the coat up. The seam was clean, almost invisible. You're good at that, Merritt said. I had to be. He took the coat from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Outside, the wind settled. The stove popped softly, and the room held heat like a worn blanket. Merritt leaned back, one hand around the cup, the other resting on the table's edge. Do you think, he asked, voice low, you might ever stop moving? Kiera traced the rim of her cup with one finger. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady. If I had reason to. He met her eyes then, and for the first time something passed between them, quiet but certain, like the first crack of spring thaw beneath the snow. Neither of them looked away. By late November, the snow had begun to hold. Not deep yet, but enough to leave quiet white along the fence rails and gather in the folds of the hills. Merritt added extra straw in the coop and moved a cot into the storeroom near the stove, just in case the cold worsened too fast. Kiera began waking earlier, lighting the fire before dawn, her hands red from the pump's chill. That morning they worked side by side in the barn, dragging a tarp over the last of the cured hay. The sky hung low and silver, promising more snow soon. You always plan ahead like this? Kiera asked, tying the rope tight around the corner beam. Merritt straightened, brushing his gloves off. I've had winters come early and hard, learned not to trust clear skies. She nodded, stepping back to judge the tarp's hold. My husband never planned for anything. We'd wait till the storm hit, then scramble. What was his name? Edric. She glanced toward the open barn door. He was good with horses, bad with promises. Merritt didn't ask further. She didn't sound bitter, just tired from living through it. I never married, he said after a pause. Thought about it once. She moved east before I could ask. Kiera didn't look at him. Did you regret not going after her? I regretted waiting too long. They stood quiet for a while, the wind slipping through the boards. Later, Merritt boiled beans and salt pork over the hearth. Kiera sat across from him, mending a frayed curtain she'd found stuffed behind a trunk. He watched her fingers work, then leaned forward slightly. You still think about teaching? Sometimes. I miss the smell of chalk. And the quiet when a room full of children listens close. She tied off a thread, but I don't know if I could do it again. You don't have to, he said. You've got enough to carry. She folded the cloth in her lap. I'm not fragile, Merritt, I know. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. The next day, a letter arrived. Merritt rode back from town with it tucked in his coat. When he handed it to her, her hands stayed still against the envelope. I didn't think anyone knew where I was. It was addressed to you. Care of this homestead. She opened it slow, reading with her lips moving soundlessly. When she finished, she folded it once and set it aside. My cousin Clara. She lives near Laramie. Said she heard I was traveling and wanted me to come stay. You thinking of going? I don't know. Her voice was unreadable. You'd be safe there? I expect so. He didn't press. The silence between them stretched into the evening. That night she stood by the edge of the porch, watching the frost gather along the grass. Merritt stepped out beside her, arms crossed. I don't want to keep you if you need to go, he said. Kiera turned her face toward his. And if I don't need to, he looked at her a long moment. Then I'd like you to stay. She didn't answer right then, but her hand found his in the dark, fingers cold and sure. In the days that followed, she didn't mention the letter again. She tucked it into a drawer and her steps settled deeper into the rhythm of the place. She began marking off the days in a small ledger she kept beside her bed, and Merritt noticed she started humming again, not while cooking, but when sweeping the porch. One afternoon, she met him behind the barn with a wrapped bundle. What's this? He asked. Your birthday. Clara's letter reminded me she used to mention it in her notes to my mother. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a scarf hand-stitched, dyed a deep pine green. I used some of the wool from the shed, she said. It's not much, it's more than I ever expected. He didn't say thank you. He just stepped forward slow and touched her cheek with the back of his hand. Her eyes closed. When her hand found his chest, resting there lightly, neither of them moved away. That night, he opened the root cellar to fetch more preserves, and she followed with the lantern. As they climbed back up, breath misting in the cold air, she said softly, I think I'm done running. I was hoping you'd say that. She reached for his hand again, and this time, when she held it, she didn't let go. The snow deepened by mid-December, rising in quiet drifts around the barn and softening the sharp edges of the land. The cabin grew smaller in the whiteness, smoke curling from the stovepipe in a thin, steady line. Kiera had taken to warming her skirts by the hearth before heading out in the morning, and Merritt started leaving the lamp lit in the window after dusk, though he never said why. One evening, after the chores were done and the wind had settled, Kiera stood at the edge of the porch with a book in hand. The cover was worn, corners soft from use. Merritt leaned against the post beside her, arms folded against the cold. You read much growing up? She asked, eyes still on the page. Not till I was near grown. My ma taught me with a Bible and a seed catalog. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That's a combination. I learned Genesis and the difference between turnip and mustard seed in the same week. She closed the book, tucking her fingers between the pages. I used to read aloud to Finn every night. He liked stories with animals that talked. Wouldn't go to sleep unless the fox won. You keep that book for him? No, she said, looking down at the frayed spine. This one's for me. He didn't ask what it was. She didn't offer. Instead, she turned and looked at the stretch of snow beyond the fence line. You ever think about leaving this place? She asked. He shook his head once. No reason to, until now. She didn't speak for a long moment, then stepped back inside, leaving the door open behind her. When the sun pushed through the clouds the next morning, Merritt found her already outside, tying branches into bundles near the smokehouse. Going somewhere? He asked, resting a hand on the fence rail. She looked up. We passed a cabin up near the ridge when you showed me the plum trees. I saw a chimney, and I think someone's living there without much. You planning to walk that far in this snow? I won't if you say no. He studied her a moment. You planning to bring them wood? I was planning to ask if they needed it. He nodded once, then went to fetch the sled. They walked in silence for most of the climb, the sled creaking behind them over the crusted snow. When they reached the clearing, the cabin stood crooked in its frame, smoke trailing weakly from the chimney. A girl opened the door when they knocked, maybe 16, with a shawl too thin for the cold and eyes that didn't flinch. A boy, younger, peeked from behind her. Inside, the walls were bare and the hearth held only ash. Kiera crouched down. We brought kindling and some dried apples. If that's all right, the girl nodded once. Our pa went to town 3 days ago, hasn't come back. Merritt stepped forward. We'll leave what we can. If he doesn't return by tomorrow, I'll come back. On the way down the hill, Kiera didn't speak. Her jaw was tight, hands red from the rope. You couldn't have known, Merritt said, his voice low. I did, she said. I've seen that look before, the girl trying not to hope. Back at the homestead, she went straight to the barn and climbed into the loft. Merritt waited, then followed, boots heavy on the ladder. She was sitting against the haystack, eyes rimmed with red but dry now. I should have stayed with them longer. You did what you could. She looked at him then, something raw and open in her face. Do you think it's possible to start again, even after everything? Not just survive, but really begin again. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. I think you already have. She leaned her head against him, slow and certain. I keep waiting for it to fall apart, she whispered. It won't, he said. Not this. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she arrived, her breath came easy. When they climbed down together, the lamp was still lit in the window. This time she reached for his hand first. The days shortened into a soft, steady rhythm. Snow came heavier by late December, covering the pasture fence rails and pressing quiet against the cabin windows. Kiera spent more time inside now, hemming a set of linen curtains she'd found folded in the trunk Merritt kept near the hearth. She didn't ask if she could use them, just set to work. her stitches even and clean, her quiet presence never pressing but always felt. Merritt came in one afternoon shaking snow from his coat, his cheeks ruddy from the wind. He set a small sack on the table and unwrapped it carefully. "Found this at the mercantile," he said. "Traded a bit of salt pork for it." Kiera leaned over to look, a tin of dried orange peel and a small spool of dark blue thread. "Is that indigo?" she asked, surprised. "Storekeep said it came through on the last freight wagon from back east." "Figured you'd find use for it." She ran her fingers over the thread gently. "You remembered my coat's lining was tearing." "I notice things," he said simply. That night he carved a second chair for the kitchen table. The one Kiera used had a slight wobble, and though she'd never said a word about it, he'd seen the way she shifted her weight to keep it steady. She watched him from the doorway, her eyes steady. "Why do you do these things for me?" He didn't look up from the draw knife. "Because I want you to stay. I already told you I would, I know, but I want to earn it." Kiera stepped into the room and picked up the wood shavings from the floor, her hands moving slowly. "You already did, Merritt." The wind rose outside, a hollow sound through the chimney. Inside, it was warm and close. He set the chair down and stood. "Come here," he said. She crossed the space between them without hesitation. He reached for her hands, calloused and red from the cold, and held them between his. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "A home with someone who doesn't need saving, just someone to build it with." She leaned her forehead to his, eyes closed. "And I never thought I'd be wanted for who I am, not what I lost." They stood like that for a long time, the only sound the soft crackle of the stove. On New Year's Day, Merritt hitched the sled and drove them out toward the ridge, not saying why. He had packed a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth and tucked it under the seat. The sky was a pale blue, and the trees sparkled with snow-crusted ice. They stopped near the old cottonwoods overlooking the west pasture. He helped her down and handed her the parcel. She opened it slowly, a wool shawl, thick and soft, dyed a deep plum. Along one corner, stitched in blue, were the letters KWP. She smiled, running her fingers over the initials. "You made this?" "Had some help from the widow Munson down in the valley. I asked her to teach me." "You've never sewn a day in your life." "Still can't," he said. "But I can learn." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and stepped close. "You already give more than most men ever try to." "I want to marry you, Kiera," he said, voice low, steady. "Not to fix anything, just to walk beside you. You'd never owe me a thing." She didn't answer right away. She looked out over the pasture, the land that had carried her from grief to quiet steadiness, and then turned back to him. "You're not asking to carry my past," she said, "just to share my future." He nodded. "That's all I want." "Then yes," she said. "I want that too." They married 3 weeks later in the warmth of the parlor, with Munson and her cousin's boy standing witness. Kiera wore a dress she dyed herself with walnut husk and stitched a row of wildflowers at the hem. Merritt stood in his best shirt, hair combed, boots polished, his eyes never leaving hers. Afterward, they shared a quiet supper with the 2 guests, then stepped out into the snow alone. The moon hung low, full and soft, casting silver across the land. "You cold?" he asked, wrapping his arm around her. She leaned into him, the shawl tight over her shoulders. "No, I've never been warmer." In spring, she planted a small garden near the house, beets, a few rows of carrots, and sowed wildflower seeds along the fence line. Merritt built her a bench near the plum trees, and every evening she sat there, writing in a small leather-bound ledger, her legs tucked beneath her. She taught 3 neighbor children to read by summer, gathering them in the shade of the cottonwoods with a slate and chalk she ordered special from town. Merritt watched from the porch sometimes, his heart steady in his chest. In the high heat of July, she came to him in the barn, brushing sawdust from her apron. "I've been feeling strange," she said. "Not ill, just different." He set down the rasp and stepped toward her. "You think?" She nodded, eyes bright. He held her then, hands careful, full of wonder. Neither spoke the word aloud. They didn't have to. That autumn, when the first leaves turned, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the light change over the hills. Kiera rested her hand over her belly, just starting to round beneath her dress. "I didn't think I'd have a second chance," she said. You gave it to yourself, Merritt said. I just cleared a place for it. They stayed there until the stars came out, the supper forgotten on the stove, the cool air rising around them like a blessing. And when he reached for her hand, she laced her fingers through his, the way she always had and always would.